Upgrading to a DDR5 based system, is it even worth it? Let's find out in this video. तो भाई DDR5 आ गई है मार्केट में, काफ़ी टाइम हो गया. एंड इफ़ यू लुक एट द रैम स्पीड, तो भाई DDR4 को तो पीछे छोड़ जाती है. It leaves it in the dust. But is it any good? Having a higher RAM speed, is that the only thing that leads to higher performance or more frames per second? Watch this video till the end because we'll compare latencies between DDR4 and DDR5 and whether, given at the current price point, should you upgrade to Ddr5 RAM. Hello and welcome to Chipsets and Frames. Thank you so much for tuning in today. यार मैं बैठा हुआ था एक दिन और मैं सोच रहा था कि DDR4 और DDR5 को ना हेड टू हेड कंपेयर करते हैं. उनकी जो लेटेंसीज हैं, जो कैश लेटेंसी है, जो रैम लेटेंसी है, लेट्स कंपेयर दैट बिकॉज DDR5 is the future. CPUs and motherboards are coming out in the market which support DDR5. Intel already supports DDR5 and AMD is coming out with their AM5 platform as well as the Ryzen 7000 CPUs which will support DDR5 only. So DDR5 is the future. इससे नहीं बचा जा सकता. So is it even worth it? Is the higher RAM speed the only criteria for more performance? Let's find out in this video. Now before we talk about latencies and cache latency, let's talk about कि RAM या DDR-RAM जो है वो कैसे काम करती है. Right, so if you take a look at your screen, this is a direct comparison between single data rate RAM and dual data rate RAM. जो DDR आजकल चल रही है, that is the dual data rate standard. Right, so इसमें जो clock cycle है, DDR में rising edge और falling edge जो clock cycle का है, उन दोनों पे data transfer operation होता है. Right, now what is cache latency और what is RAM latency? जब ये सिग्नल भेजा जाता है कि भाई मेरे को फलाना डेटा चाहिए टू द रैम कंट्रोलर, जब वो सिग्नल जनरेट होता है दैट आई नीड सम XYZ डेटा, उस टाइम से लेके जब तक वो डेटा अवेलेबल है ऑन द पिन्स ऑफ द रैम, जो वो कनेक्टर्स होते हैं डिम के, दैट इज नोन एज रैम लेटेंसी. दैट इज व्हाट वील कंपेयर टुडे. रैम का हमने देख लिया, DDR कैसे काम करता है एंड व्हाट इज रैम लेटेंसी एंड हाउ दिस अफेक्ट्स परफॉर्मेंस. इज दैट जितनी ज़्यादा लेटेंसी होगी यार, उतना ज़्यादा डेटा ट्रांसफ़र में डिले होगा. तो जितना भी टू एंड फ्रो डेटा हो रहा है बिटवीन रैम CPU, वो स्लो होता जाएगा एंड परफॉर्मेंस कम होती जाएगी सिस्टम की. राइट, सो द लेसर द लेटेंसी, द फास्टर द डेटा एक्सेस रेट विल बी. दैट विल डायरेक्टली इम्पैक्ट परफॉर्मेंस. ऑलराइट, तो अब अगर DDR5 की स्पेसिफिकेशंस की बात करें, सो लेट्स टेक अ लुक एट अ फ्यू ऑफ द बेस्ट DDR5 RAM kits which are available for gaming in 2022. So it's just a quick Google search which led me to this result. PCgamer.com पे ये एक लिस्ट बनाई हुई है इन्होंने. So let's just go through this list and we'll be able to see कि भाई क्या कॉमन DDR5 स्पीड्स चल रही हैं, क्या कैश लेटेंसी चल रही है. So straight off the bat we see that DDR5 begins with 4800 MHz and it can go up to 6400 MHz. धीरे धीरे जैसे टेक्नोलॉजी मैच्योर होगी, we might find higher frequency kits as well. Let's take a look at a few kits. Right, so जो G-Skill Trident Z5 है, that is a DDR5 6000 MHz kit with a cache latency of 36, 6000 MHz and cache latency 36. Moving on, crucial की है DDR5 4800 MHz with a cache latency of 40. Corsair Vengeance है again 4800 MHz with a cache latency of 40. So अगर आप एक पैटर्न देखें, you can make out the pattern that the frequency is high, the RAM speed is high, but the cache latency is also worse as compared to DDR4. We wanted to compare latency in this video and that's exactly what we'll do. DDR5 6000 MHz Kingston Fury Beast with a cache latency of 40. Right, so this is a trend. The next one, Team Group T-Force Delta, DDR5 6400 MHz with a cache latency of 40. These are a few recommended DDR5 kits which are available in the market, right, with very high RAM speeds and a bit higher cache latency, right. So these are the DDR5 specs. Now let's move on to the next section where we'll translate these cache latencies and RAM speeds into the total RAM latency in time. Now let's talk about Ram latency calculation, right. This will be in nanoseconds. Time is time. राइट, चाहे DDR4 हो चाहे DDR5 हो, एंड नैनो सेकेंड इज अ वेरी शॉर्ट स्पैन ऑफ टाइम. लेट्स टेक अ लुक एट द रैम लेटेंसी कि कितना टाइम लगता है इन अ DDR4 चिप and a DDR5 chip. Taking a look at the RAM latency calculator, this is a free tool online, just do a Google search for this. तो जो सबसे कॉमन जो DDR4 स्टैंडर्ड चल रहा है, that is 3200 MHz with a cache latency of 16. Right, so 3200 megahertz or 3200 mega transfers per second, they are interchangeable right now. So 3200 mega transfers per second with a cache latency of 16, this is the most commonly available DDR4 standard, and you get a RAM latency of 10 nanoseconds. Right, so इस फिगर को और इस कैलकुलेशन को याद रखना. ये कैसे करते हैं कैलकुलेशन, एंड if you are interested in the formula, do let me know, voice it in the comment section and I'll respond back. 3200 मेगाहर्ट्ज, कैश लेटेंसी 16, 10 नैनोसेकेंड्स का लेटेंसी आती है. ऑलराइट, नाउ लेट्स टॉक अबाउट द DDR5 RAM latency. किट्स अवेलेबल हैं, काफ़ी किट्स अवेलेबल हैं मार्केट में, but they are costly. They are hell lot of costly, man. So DDR5, let's take the most basic standard, 4800 megahertz with a cache latency of 40. This comes out to 16.66 nanoseconds. So it is 6.66 nanoseconds slower than a DDR4 RAM, which has lower RAM speed, right? Which has a 3200 megahertz RAM speed. DDR4 is faster than DDR5.
गजब बेइज्जती है.
ये तो अभी साबित हो गया है. बट लेट्स से अब अगर हम रैम स्पीड बढ़ा लेते हैं यार, क्योंकि व्हेन वी सी रैम इन द मार्केट वे लाइक ओ 5600 मेगाहर्ट्ज और 6000 मेगाहर्ट्ज, राइट, और रैम स्पीड बहुत ज़्यादा है, राइट. सो लेट्स कीप द कैश लेटेंसी द सेम and let's take a look at a 6000 megahertz RAM speed DIMM, DDR5 DIMM. उसकी क्या latency है? So that comes out to 13.33 nanoseconds, right? ये भी DDR4 3200 megahertz cache latency 16 RAM से slower होगी या ज़्यादा latency होगी in terms of fetching data, right, by 3.33 nanoseconds. Whereas so this is like 33% slower, DDR5 6000 megahertz की, and जो DDR5 4800 megahertz है with a cache latency of 40, that is 66% slower. Now let's compute 6400 with a cache latency of 40, that comes out to 12.5 nanoseconds, right? Still it is slower, it is 25% slower than a DDR4 3200 megahertz DIMM. So right, पैसे भी ज़्यादा है, DDR5 gets a costlier than DDR4, but RAM latency बढ़ गई. To make this work, जो turning point आएगा ना DDR5 adoption का, that would be when cache latency goes down to less than 30, right? 30 के नीचे जब cache latency जाने लगेगी ना, timings tight होने लगेंगी, that's when DDR5 will be useful when it comes to everyday computing, when it comes to gaming, getting more performance out of your system. G-Skill has launched a couple of DIMMs which have a cache latency of 28. So ये जो DIMMs हैं ये 5200 megahertz में भी आती हैं, 5600 megahertz version में भी आती है. So that is something which is still comparable to a DDR4 DIMM. 5600 megahertz का देख लेते हैं with a cache latency of 28. This comes out to 10 nanoseconds. So this will be the sweet spot because 10 nanoseconds is the same latency as we get in DDR4 DIMMs right now. The frequency will be much higher with higher RAM speeds and higher bandwidth. So this will be the point when DDR5 totally blows it out of the park. Now if we talk about the final verdict, right, between DDR4 and DDR5, I'll divide this into two categories. One would be the performance, the other would be price. So if we talk about the performance point of view, DDR5 has more bandwidth as compared to DDR4. If you take a look at the graph, thanks Tom's Hardware, I just borrowed these from there. So DDR5 leaves DDR4 in the dust, right? There's almost a gain of 10 gigabytes per second when we move from DDR4 4000 megahertz to DDR5 4800 megahertz. On the other hand, if we talk about latency, तो latency जो है वो DDR5 की ज़्यादा है. DDR5 has higher latency as compared to DDR4. Again, courtesy of Tom's Hardware, तो DDR4 4000 with a cache latency of 16 has the lowest latency, right? जो हमने numbers पहले calculate किए थे latency के, they were very simplified numbers. They did not take into account latency on the motherboard, latency, the amount of time it takes the signal to reach the CPU or come back from the CPU, etc. So we are not accounting for that. But these test or this graph accounts for those latencies points as well. So DDR4 4000 cache latency 16, DDR4 3600 cache latency 16, 3200 cache latency 15 in सबकी जो memory latency है that is lower than DDR5. So this is what I wanted to say, that DDR5 has higher latency as compared to DDR4, but memory bandwidth and other parameters are better than DDR4. Now if you talk about pricing, so अभी जो pricing चल रही है यार बहुत premium pricing चल रही है DDR5 kits की. The availability is less and the pricing is way too high. So right now I would say it is not a good value proposition and there's no point in moving to DDR5 except for the novelty value. बहुत ज़्यादा गेमिंग में डिफरेंस या बहुत ज़्यादा रियल वर्ल्ड एप्लीकेशंस में डिफरेंस अभी नहीं है,
तो रहने दो.
बट if you go with that DIMM that I was talking about with the cache latency of 28 and memory frequency of 5600 megahertz, but that's the sweet spot. It's going to leave DDR4 behind. But as of now, latency is very high, pricing is very high. So I would say stay away from DDR5 for now. But as the memory and the architecture matures, these things will get better. The memory frequency, cache latency will get better, and DDR5 will become a better value proposition. But do not dismiss DDR5. Right, final thoughts, do not dismiss DDR5 as well, because see, it has a lot of improvements. First of all, it has many architectural changes, like it has higher bandwidth, वो हमने देखा भी, on chip power management है, on die error correction है, a lot of changes, architecturally to increase efficiency, to increase memory bandwidth. So DDR5 is here to stay, it is the future, but it is not a viable step right now. जैसे कहते हैं भाई, जैसे हर चमकती चीज सोना नहीं होती, वैसे ही न्यूअर इज ऑलवेज नॉट बेटर. तो DDR5 अभी के लिए इज नॉट अ गुड वैल्यू प्रोपोजिशन. स्टिक विद DDR4 इफ यूर इनटू गेमिंग, इफ यूर इनटू कंटेंट क्रिएशन. बहुत हैवी मेमोरी इंटेंसिव टास्क्स हैं जैसे सर्वर्स वगैरह हैं, दे विल स्टिल बेनिफिट फ्रॉम DDR5 किट्स. So thank you for sticking with me till the end. That's it for this video. Do like and subscribe to the channel for more content on PC tech discussions, PC gameplays. One more thing, the overwhelming response on my latest video around MD computers and the Rath Yatra sale that they did. Oh man, I was mind blown. Overwhelming response, very positive response. Thank you so much, community. Thank you so much for the support. If you haven't watched it, I'll link it down below in the description. Go ahead and watch that video as well. So do subscribe, hit that subscribe button. It's totally free, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.